and welcome everyone. Very happy to see you all being there tonight because tonight we have once again lead game designer Bloodmordius from Omeda Studios that is joining us for an interview, and this time we are going to talk about items in Predecessor. And to be fair, that's a topic I'm very excited about because I feel like Predecessor is doing like a lot of things like differently from others MOBA, and I can't wait to see why is the reasoning behind all of that. And so like it's also like the chance for everyone in chat, if you have any question for Blood, to take the chance about that. I think there is no need to introduce you once again, Bloodmordius, because like people start to know you very well in the community, I would say. I know that since that Ray is coming back into the team, I think like you let a little bit of the balance side more on his side. I know you're focusing like fully mainly on the new product, like the characters and stuff. And probably like also you still have like some regards when it comes to like the item and the overall like direction of the game, of course. But like I can't, like I'm sure like there's like a ton of heroes in the pipeline, but we're not here to discuss about heroes. We're here about discussing items. Welcome, Bloodmordius. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Yeah, no, pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me on.
So I guess like here we want to enter directly into the fray, and like my first question will be, of course, like Predecessor come from the hashes of Paragon, and Paragon also already have like a very like the card system that some people love, some people like didn't like, and I guess like we have to start from there. Like what pursued the decision of like completely discarding this card system and decided to just like go for a more typical like item shop that we see in other MOBAs?
Gosh, yes, this could get pretty in depth, so I'll try and keep it somewhat brief because there's quite funny stories regarding the card system and Predecessor in general, right? We consider a lot whether we go item system or card system, and for myself, when it came into it, I was just very sold on item system over card system, right? I loved Paragon, I loved a lot of the things it did with the card system. There's really cool aspects of it, right? Just the general of picking your colors and stuff and building your deck. It's cool concepts. The biggest issue is always the limitations of, you're bringing X amount of items into a game, your counter building is weaker, your counterplay is weaker, the variety of strategy becomes weaker within that individual sort of game that you're indexing on, which isn't as open or enjoyable, I think, as a gameplay sort of like fundamental for the system. But it does have its benefits. So you can be somewhat creative with it, you can hone builds on certain aspects, and you can sort of know what people are doing because of what colors they take and things, and the other benefits that come with this. The themes of them are really cool. There's the idea that you've got kind of a tank one, you've kind of got a carry one, you kind of got a support one, and that can kind of like decide a lot of things. So there's some cool aspects of it. And honestly, when it came to like the first card system, the first iteration, I think that was definitely the weaker of the two, mainly because it was more stat driven than anything. Effects were much weaker because you can't gate them behind the idea that you have to build up to an item. You can buy the effect from the first get go, and then some of them are on completion, but most of them are actually up front. Maybe if they gated more by on completion of the little things, that'd be better. But then you still only have to put like 1/1 into this as free extra card points, right? So imagine you could buy like sort of sword in our game, and then you could, for the price of another sword, get the effect of the item. That wouldn't work. It just doesn't work in that regard. You acquire the effect too easily, which makes it really hard to gate, especially because you want that customization of how fast people can get these completed item effects. So in general, sort of meaningful effects are harder to create in that system. The second set did it better. When it comes to that aspect, it was harder to acquire the stronger effects and stuff. They had some more natural gates to them. The thing that was really clever about that system was the attribute system. I actually thought that was much better than people probably give it credit for. Just the idea that you can always spend your money, and it's always towards something meaningful, and it's pushing you towards these gems, towards these cards, and giving you stats as you go as well. I think these were pretty well thought out. It even came to a point where when we'd already implemented the item system, and we were going back to it and thinking, could we improve it? Could we make it a bit more unique, make it better? We actually went back and thought, maybe the attribute system wasn't so bad, right? Maybe this is something we could have done. You can start to see the angles where if you put your mind into sort of like where Epic's game designers were and trying to create this unique system, you can see how they came to the conclusions that they did, to the point where you're like, yeah, actually, this isn't actually that bad when you look at it on certain levels. So you could have actually just done a card system. It could be good. But I'm still happy we stuck with item system. I think it's obviously a more tested sort of system more than anything out of multiple versions of the game. But I think it is just providing so much benefit to the way the game is played, the way it's structured, the way it flows. When power spikes are defined and all these things with characters, I think the item system is a bit more superior in these regards. As I said, the openness of you can have any item. Card shop would be a lot harder to do that with the idea of the freely ability to swap and having this limited deck was kind of a necessity to the system. Whereas item system, you don't need that stuff as much. So yeah, in general, those are sort of the core reasons we went for the item system. It just sort of complements the style of game we're going for. I think if you're in a more lax environment where you can make the game a little bit more casual, you can have a little less like indexing on counterplay and specific like matchups and stuff, and sort of like the general item strength relative to the character strength. I think if these become more lax, you can start to opt into the card system more, and it can provide more overall fun for the game. But I think anything the card system can accomplish within a competitive game can be done through an item system plus more, and with healthier gates, basically.
Okay, and I think like that kind of transition well into like my next question, which is like basically we see the item shop. Like I think like Predecessor can have enough like differences from other MOBA that it doesn't need to like go as hard as Paragon was doing in terms of like also like this third person view with verticality and on top like card system, and maybe it's like a little too much. We don't want to lose everyone here, but like you mentioned a very important component, and I think it kind of see in the design, and especially in the design of Crest, which is like to be able to adapt what you're doing during the in-game and based on the composition and also like the counter building aspect. And so that kind of shift me towards the crest, because like we can see that in the crest design actually like I think it's very important for you, and that's just like what I understand from what I'm seeing in game, but that you choose your crest based on what you want to do that game or what you're facing. And so like, and maybe you iterate more about the crest. So first, like there is a lot of things around crest, like there's like this adaptability, but also like that's the only actives in the game, like besides like the potion and stuff. So maybe we can develop a little bit on those aspects.
Yeah. Just sort of tying that in as well in terms of back to sort of Paragon in terms of so when we've got the item system in this sort of form, the one issue of Paragon is that what the card system was trying to do, for example, was pull a certain type of player to the game, whereas those people wouldn't typically play, for example, a shooter. Let's say so you've got people that play Magic the Gathering, you've got people that play Overwatch, right? What Paragon was attempting to do was to like bring these together, and sort of capture all these audiences. So the way you sort of you can treat it like a triangle or a square, and you've got all these different players in different corners, and you're trying to like reach into all these different corners, right? So League actually does a pretty good job. It kind of sits in the middle. It doesn't reach too far into any corners. It like sort of pulls some people from some genre, some from another. It's actually pretty open, which is why it's very successful. Paragon kind of wanted to be more ambitious and do that more and push into those corners more, which is where it started to like get people that just don't want to interact with the card system, right? So I know it's kind of diverging from the point, but just something I thought I'd add. But that's what ends up sort of like drawing people away, right? If I'm a player that comes in and I want to play an Overwatch type of game, this card system is something I actually have to learn because it's catered towards people that want to learn that. Item systems do the recommended in a way that's just much better, a way that just sort of flows better. You know, that there are more set builds that just work. People can just plug and play, and they can focus more on the mechanical aspect of the game and enjoy that, which happens with League a lot. Whereas when it comes to these sort of like other players and stuff like that might be focused on more of this tactical aspect, then they're not going to like the actual core gameplay of the game and stuff. You end up like sort of going so far into like all of them that you push away from the others, right? It's always a push and pull, I think, and I think finding the safe middle ground is actually really hard. And then back in Flame System, I think that's what this does better, right? So especially with Crest, like you mentioned, you provide these free options and stuff. It still does what the item system does, where there's like a recommended, there's a good option there that you can pick, and you can go for, and it'll be fine every single game, and you're probably not going to have problems with it. But a smart player can now pick the correct one of the free choices, or maybe you've picked a different starting crest and picked a different one. And this allows them to then get a really big edge if they can utilize that in the correct moments. So that's sort of like trying to complement that idea of we want those players to feel smart for acquiring these kind of things and using tactical advantages, and pull those kind of players without making it so much of a necessity that you feel like you have to actually spend time and sit down and think about these things too much. Because if you do, then you start to detract from that other side of the player base, basically, that just want to run around, kill stuff, and have fun.
Yeah, definitely. Like it's a very important point. Like when you start a MOBA, and I remember when I played the first few games of Predecessor, I just like, oh, I don't want to go through the whole shop. Oh, recommended build, perfect. I'm just gonna go with that and go with the flow. And then after you play a few games, you say like, okay, no, I want to be a better player. How can I interact with the system? And then you start to learn them just a little bit. But at the beginning, you're just like, I just want to enjoy and press some buttons and shoot things basically. So,
Yeah. Yeah, and that's kind of one thing Paragon always struggle with, right? Is onboarding people to the concepts. And it tried to do that through these gates of like you can only have a certain amount of cards in your deck, which limits the choice, so it's not so like hard on your brain if there's all these items and stuff. So they tried to do those kind of things, but it's still a system you had to learn in order to actually be good at the game because of how impactful these things were. And you didn't have a good way to like onboard people to that process, and that's where it kind of fell apart pretty much. Whereas, like you said, with item systems, it just goes, it does its job, and you can play the game at a normal pace, and it feels fine. You won't have any issues, and you can pick it up when you want to pick it up, right? So these players are less likely to churn, for example, when they're interacting with these systems.
yes, and so we have like this whole thing that you kind of help with the onboarding, and I like when with the crest system and like this leveling up of crest and kind of like a free item. I assume it's also like create like some like very specific power spike that doesn't necessarily like exist in other MOBAs, and like what is like the idea behind that, and is it like something that you need to pay attention because it creates like very strong dynamic of power, but also like very strong dynamic of power that is easy to understand for players. So like what was like the whole thought process and why we have gone into that direction compared to like a natural 6 slot as like other MOBAs can do it sometimes.
Yeah, so I'd say that this is probably one of the biggest weaknesses of the crest system, if anything, right? So when I designed the crest system, it was built for a purpose that it's trying to do quite a lot of things, right? So if you think about like what all the tools that League has, for example, they have summoner spells, they have a rune system, and they have the item system. We weren't able to build all this stuff because it's new, and obviously we probably have it at some point. But I feel like our game has to still keep up a little bit faster by having some more depth to it earlier, rather than like being season 1 League without runes and masteries, right? Imagine that. It falls a little bit more flat, especially when people have played with MOBAs for such a long period of time. They kind of come in and just instantly expect a bit more depth. There's the people obviously haven't played MOBAs before that we're also trying to capture, so we don't want to go too far and make all these systems immediately and also stall out the release of the game for the purpose of that. So that's what Crest was seeking to do. They're seeking to cover up the fact that you've kind of got this additional choice that's going to be like a powerful active in gameplay, like a summoner spell. It's also curving your stats, kind of like runes and stuff would do across a game, right? You're actually handpicking a select set of stats that cater towards your character and can alter the character in different ways, kind of like runes would. So it's kind of covering those two categories, utilizing an item spot and a spike. And the biggest issue with it is it does make this like when does it come online kind of idea, right? We've always tried to pace it between first and second item, so it's kind of like you still have that slow strategical start to a MOBA. You always have your laning phase. You got to get to that one item spike. How do I progress towards that? The crest also fills starter items, for example, right? We got rid of those, and it fills that hole as well. So it's kind of filling like 4 different holes at this point, which is always the biggest issue. It kind of pulls away, and it's probably why it'll be like rethought in the future, right? And reworked at some point. It's just because currently that's what it's been trying to do, and it's done that well, and I think it's done great, and I've loved it, and it's like a baby to me. But it's got issues because of what it's trying to do, and that's not its fault. That just means we need to come up with systems that work for those things eventually, and we can start pulling that away from the crest system, and that area can develop into its own sort of thing. But otherwise, yeah, I think they do it good. I think it allows a good proper amount of customization. I think they do come online at the right spot. They do create the awkward situation where you get one item, and if you're doing really well and you get your crest immediately after, that's like another really powerful spike pretty quickly, and then you get second item as well, which is a powerful spike pretty quickly. It sort of creates an unnatural gap between 1, 2, 3, which can be a little bit rough at times, and it makes certain characters too strong for unnecessary reasons and stuff. It comes with its own issues, but I think that's like the lesser of the two evils than just having another item slot there, no crest, no depth and stuff, and having to make star items again and utilizing those. And it's also the idea that it's a star item that you don't sell as well, right? Like there is some benefit to having items like Doran's Shield. You pick that up, you lane with it, and you sell it when you want to sell it. There's some perks to that, but it's also the idea that you are buying something that you're going to get rid of and lose gold for, right? Essentially, and Crest was seeking to sort of like remedy that a little bit as well. So there was like lots of things they were trying to solve, and too many, which is why they're in the issue they're in now. But as I said, I think that's better than the alternatives.
Yeah, and also like we can see that like the quest system has evolved since like the beginning of the early access. Like a lot of stats has been a little bit removed from them, so they're like more like less like power spiky in a sense. We also see that like I'm always like analyzing the stats of every single tournament, and we can see like all the change you have done to the different passive that now like the amount of crest that is being taken is much more varied. We still have sometimes like some outliers that happens from time to time, but we definitely see like it's like much more like a good environment. Like before, like we're saying like Razorback every single time, we're saying like always like the same type of crest and never changing. And now we still like no, we even see that people start to go for more mid aggressive strategy with the time flux bands on casters. So like we can see like there is definitely like potential, and player are actually like interacting well with this quest system. And I think like it's also like not too complicated for new players that just joining and a way to explore. Yeah. So far, I think it's like, of course, like you explained, you can see like they were trying to cover so many things, but I feel like you managed to tune down a lot of those things to get to a better spot, and we'll see like in the future how we can like stop like the convolution of too many solution on the crest. Last thing like I think we can say about crest is like some people are a big advocate of like every single slot should be an active item. Personally, I'm not an advocate of that. I hate when it's like that. But what is like the main reasoning behind like only one active and the rest is like passive that you activate naturally through the gameplay?
Yeah, so we do technically have limited slots to work with per se. And when Crest was introduced and stuff, we kind of had a plan on what we want those other slots to be for now. Again, this isn't stuff that's like set in stone forever, you know, it's not like we have Crest, active item, like refillable slot and trinket, and that's what we'll have forever, we're never going to change it. I'd say Crest is probably going to get broken down into different pieces at certain points. We'll have like maybe a tertiary system and, you know, all these other systems that then Crests are less needed, right? And they might not even exist in future or exist in a different form. And there'll be better systems to replace it. But when it comes to like the active item slots themselves, yes, we do have limited slots. We have to work with those. We know we want a vision system slot in general, and for that to be dedicated to vision, that's like super important for our game in the long term and how we make it competitive. We've also got Blink being used as a thing that's pretty standard. We expect everyone to almost always run Blink, even if we had alternatives, unless they were like ridiculously powerful, which is going to end up into really hard balance troughs and stuff, so we didn't want to encounter that yet. Maybe it's something we discover in future, but you know, you've got to build all the tech for when do they pick Blink, is it in draft, and then what are the alternatives, and then the balance, and there's a lot of stuff that goes into that. So it wasn't time we were going to spend on that kind of stuff yet, because we knew Blink would suit the purpose currently, as you know, like Flash in League does, right? It's just a consistent staple, 90% of characters use it all the time. It's something we knew would just be reliable and stick in that slot nicely for now, until we can allow customization in that area. And then, yeah, then you've got the crest and the active item slot, which is currently Hunt and Refillable. Hunt and Refillable is definitely going to get reworked sooner than the rest of it. I think I've stated that before, where we're going to look into enhancing that slot a bit more. We might have like varieties of jungle items that can do different things rather than just smite the jungle monster. There's several pitfalls that can come into, right? Like we can't do the same sort of smiting system as League, where you have like an ability to smite an enemy hero, because then there's body blocking the characters on epic jungle monsters. Now I can't smite the Fang because Altered Rampage is in the way. That's super frustrating. So you have to like rework how Hunt would work at that point, and is that a good, is that a bad thing? There's a million sort of like design questions to answer around that kind of concept, which is really difficult. But we do know we want other stuff in that slot. I've been really a big advocate for trying to remove cleanses from the crest system and move them into that slot, for example. So because cleanse is something that you might want to pick up most games, and I don't want that to be in the crest system, because the whole purpose of the crest system is like, how do I want to play the game, and what am I going to enjoy playing this game as? Do I want like more burst and be more like an assassin? Do I want to be more DPS oriented? Do I want sustain? When CC comes into the question, it's like, oh, they got a high CC team, I pick up my cleanse crest, and that kind of feels like I don't get to play the game I want to play because I now have to pick up cleanse, rather than I get to play the way I want to play, and I can counter CC in this other way. CC probably shouldn't be one of those things that like defines the crest I'm picking basically in the playstyle I'm going to go for. I'd rather crest complemented your playstyle in other ways, and that would be much more enjoyable. So that'd be an example of how I start to separate things from the crest system and utilize that slot more. But due to the limited slots, that's the main reason why there's not as many currently. Otherwise, we would just have more active slots available and maybe more options in them. But we can't do those for the current layout and system. Maybe we find more solutions in that future, potentially. But till then, it's mostly going to be how we utilize the crest slot, how we change up that active item slot, and then whether we have to change up Blink at any point to be customizable.
Okay. So that's interesting because it's bringing like also like another point that I think is like kind of different like from certain MOBAs is like we do have like those two additional slot, the vision slot and the potion and slot, and that kind of ties to like my next two question, and I will start with the first one, which is like basically like we have in Predecessor like free potion and free wards for everyone. And that's something that is kind of different because like most other MOBAs, you have to buy your wards, you have to buy your vision. And how that, like, why did you decide to go through that direction? And like, what are the implications compared to other MOBAs that now you have free wards for everyone?
Yeah, so generally it creates like, so some lanes are super awkward in terms of acquiring vision for reliably. We don't want supports to be this role that has to like purchase all your wards, for example, and stuff like that. So we don't want to run into that sort of Dota style of gameplay where your support's really low economy. So that's one thing we definitely wanted to avoid. So by giving everyone a bit of natural vision, they have control over their own independent vision as a player in solo queue. That's like better, if my support's not doing well, we can still acquire vision as the rest of the four of us and stuff. That's perfectly fine. Even if they do control the best warding item, they don't have all the vision on them, more towards like Dota and stuff, so you can shift away from that, which is nice. And then in general, things like mid lane, that's a super hard lane to ward for in the first place, just due to all the entrances. It's the monolith style of mid lane. It's hard to stay safe, so just having a ward all the time is really nice for a mid laner in that regard and keeping them safe. So we definitely always wanted them to have vision control, whereas mid's just going to end up being a gold sink into more wards and stuff. We might have other solutions for that in future, but currently it's just the trinket's going to help with that. And in general, we just think it's just like a really solid system for vision control. I think it needs more refinement, whether it's on durations of wards, cooldowns, same with the lens, the radius which they cover could be bigger. There's all these other things we'll be looking at, how long the ward lasts before it turns invisible. Just more things to mind game the vision game a little bit more. When we're looking at these other active slots, I really want to like consider how can we incorporate other aspects of vision into them if you want to go even further than that and go more into the information route of gameplay, and acquiring information at the sacrifice of losing combat ability basically or something. There's definitely angles there. Paragon was looking to explore that at the end of its life with certain cards, like you could kill a jungle camp and you'd get vision of that area for a period of time whilst the camp is dead, and that can be a way for like a jungler to acquire vision in the enemy jungle and track junglers and stuff. That was really cool. There's like loads of ideas like this we could explore, and we can also explore different trinkets, right? In our 3D space we could have like Wraith and Paragon could fire these little orbs that went over the wall and did little scannings. We could do a similar thing as a trinket even if we wanted to, so that like you could have a lower cooldown, less duration, and then you can use it to scout, for example, and go check around corners and stuff, maybe as a carry, and things like that, kind of similar to how like scrying is used in League. We could do like tripwires and stuff, right, which is a thing that could connect 2 points and you could walk through and it could provide vision of that person, maybe even slow them and do an effect. You can do all sorts of things in our environment, and we'd love to explore that as well.
Okay.
But yeah, so we think that's mainly beneficial. And then potions in general, we think is just healthy to have sustain in lane. Arguably, there should be a money sink into it, and if we do rework that slot, that's something I want to explore, is making it so there's a money sink into acquiring more sustain, so you can opt into more sustain than general. So we'd pace it in a way that you're not going to lose more gold than you basically get currently for the same value of sustain, but if you want more sustain, you can opt in for more money for that sustain, and you should always opt into some money for sustain so you can forego your refillable sustain that you're getting currently in order to progress other items quicker.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting because also like that's something like the wards, I really like it because then like when you're a new player, actually like you start to play with the wards and you just like it's easier to gain vision. Well, like the potion system, like it's kind of nice, but also like I find that like as the onboarding a new player, like most of the time I was just like forgetting that I need to press the button every time I fight. Otherwise, I just like fall behind against a player that just know how to press the button. So like I kind of agree that there is like not exactly like the same thing here, but like all the thing you're talking about is very, very interesting. Like it's also one thing I really like about is the Soulstone Wars, that like as a support, I used to be a support main in previous MOBAs, and like most of the time, like I don't need to go back to base most of the time because I don't have gold to spend. But like this refill aspect, like kind of force that into like your gameplay, and so now you have like incentive and you can control the map better. And so like basically like what I'm hearing so far is like we have a structure of like the item system that your overall like is working, and there is like a lot of potential to expand in the future. That will be done in the future, like the expansion, but like we have a lot of cool things that we can like explore and create later on. And so that will tie to like the last game I have like last question I have regarding like this whole structure of like the itemization, which is like right now we only have one objective secure tools, and it's like tied to the jungler mandatorily, which means that it puts like a lot of pressure on junglers, especially on new players that are junglers. And if your jungler don't know like objective, like you can't really play them, and they're a big part of the game. So
Yeah, that was one of the benefits of passive smite that we had previously, where just hitting the camp, it executed it under a certain threshold and killed it. That was a really good one for new players and stuff like that, just because in general, they don't have to think about when they press this button or stress as much about that. They've just got to hit the thing as much as possible. It also led to more interesting interactions with melee characters in terms of how they have to access the camp instead of smiting at range. But we did prefer the variance that range smite provided in that regard, and the sort of different gameplay it can make when you like blink over into the pit. You don't have to be on this thing and basic attack it. You can just smite, and that's a really impactful moment. It makes steals more exciting. Those are things we actually wanted to complement, which does take away from that onboarding aspect of Hunt and for newer players, which is tricky. But jungle's always been one of the most new player and friendly roles in most MOBAs. It always is and always will be, I think, as much as we can make it healthier. We'd rather make it healthier in other areas, which we are investigating. It won't be that long before we have some updates to that, when it comes to just the sort of like QOL of, you know, how do you attack a camp, how do you pull a camp around, and how do you play around it to have an optimal clear, and all these things, and how does a jungle camp work. All these things will be visually clarified a little bit better soon, which will be nice. But yeah, in terms of Hunt itself, it kind of is an item in terms of what it is. You know, when you're at the level where you are brand new, and you're not utilizing it as much, I don't think that's a huge issue. You're going to be with people that are struggling to utilize the same sort of tools in other roles and stuff, and it shouldn't have a huge impact on you, especially with the majority of characters. It's also something we'll be onboarding through role-specific tutorials, which will hopefully help. We'll have those eventually. So the jungle tutorial will teach you about Hunt, what does it do, which will be nice. So hopefully that will assist in that regard. But the functionality itself, I don't think, can be differed much more without damaging the competitive aspect of the item itself. Would be my worry.
And so like the question was probably also like a little bit of like I remember that at some point like on Smite for instance, End of the God was like available for purchase for anyone, and that this thing like is like this type of secure objective tool will always like be only on for the jungler, or it's something that as you were talking about reworking like this like item slot, like is it something that maybe of course like here right now we have the hunt that is also like convoluted with the aspect of like not stealing like wave, helping the clear. There is like a lot of things going on that item to make jungle balance, so it's not that simple as I'm talking about it. But like is it something that we can explore in the future, because sometimes we go for a jungler that's not good at securing objective, but your support is actually like very good at doing that, for instance.
Yeah, it does come into sell that individual player agency per role kind of argument, and it is a big one. It's something we have discussed. Jungle items being bought multiple on a team is definitely an issue. We've actually seen that in Overprime more recently than anything. 5 people picking it up and just nuking objectives is obviously not an okay thing, so you can't balance around that. And then you end up doing weird things where they ended up, I think, distributing the amount of damage it could do based on how many your team has bought or something, or is in the game. So if your teammate bought the jungle item, he's now griefing you because your jungle item now does half damage on its smite. So you actually end up with more obscene issues and stuff that cause problems. So this basically becomes like the lesser of all those evils. I think being able to stack jungle secure is a problem. So you can't do that, so you can only have one. How do you actually take that away from the jungler is really difficult. Obviously we factor that into so many aspects of their gameplay when it comes to their just general jungle clear and the way they secure their buffs and everything. It does put a lot of pressure and weight on them when it comes to these epic monster fights, but that's also the moments that those players can sometimes play for. That's one of the reasons to play that role. Of no other role has to worry about that aspect of the game. Just like supports indicate more and keeping their team alive and providing vision. Junglers provide ganking assistance, and they provide epic monster secure. That's some of the things they do. And it also draws that kind of player. That's why I was more of a jungler myself, is because it's more team leaderish in that regard, right? In terms of how you dictate where your team goes, because when it hits that mid game, neutral objectives are a large amount of the way the game is played. So if you're the one that's dictating when those are done because you have the thing to secure them, that innately puts you in a position where your team feel like they have to follow what you're going to do, and that naturally makes that role more of a team leader role, and that can appeal to a lot of people, right? Whereas the other roles are usually not as much like that. The carry's just, you know, your pop off 1v9 kind of guy who wants to just murder everyone in the middle of team fights in the late game. Your support wants to keep everyone alive. Your mid laner wants to be this person that just sort of like pops off in the mid lane, sort of roams around, controls team fights and stuff, maybe provides more utility in certain cases. The off lane is usually those tank players that want to be a big chunky frontliner for their team. And there's obviously variations within this, but they're just sort of generic examples. And most junglers tend to fall more into that category, and it's the only role you can really provide that experience with as much, due to the nature of the hunt item being restricted to them and smite being restricted to them. So that said, it has its benefits, which is the good thing, and the downsides of doing all the alternatives are pretty great and don't come with those advantages either, and lesser advantages. I do like individual autonomy, but I feel like this is an area you can't provide it as much across the roles, and jungler securing will be, or objective securing will be more of a jungler thing. At the end of the day, you don't need a jungler to secure the objectives if you're winning really hard, or if you're popping off and killing everyone. You know, if the enemy team's dead, they can't steal it. So you can always play better in your role in that regard, and because the roles all do stuff differently in that regard, there's always potential for that, right? And there's always the ability to carry the game in other means. But it is an issue, right? It is the reason why jungle is one of the top solo queue roles that contributes, as well as its impact across the map.
Well, to be fair, like you said, like at some point, no solution is perfect, and we have to choose like the solution we prefer for what we're trying to achieve in the game. And kind of like all the explanation here. Here it's like more like last two questions about like the current design of predecessor items, and one is like actually like there is a lot of item, there is like a lot of effect, and probably like as myself like learning to go into like the details of the data, like how certain are we sure that all the description and effect are actually aligned? And if we test stuff and we found out that something like is maybe fishy, like how can we provide like that information to the dev team so we can like all together contribute to like having all those things like very clean and just like everything say what it's supposed to say and do what it's supposed to do?
Yeah, I mean, we read pretty much everything that's on the forums and Reddit posts when these things pop up. I've seen them multiple times, especially in terms of inconsistent interactions with items. They can occur. Item system is pretty in-depth in general for most MOBAs. I think ours actually has more so than a lot of others in terms of sort of interactions within itself rather than just with the characters. You know, we don't have a ton of complex characters which these items interact with in a way that could cause problems or bugs or inconsistencies, but we do have larger issues with item-to-item interactions because we have a lot more items that provide damage of some sort, just random T3s that do damage in certain ways, and whether these are dots or AoEs, and how do these proc on certain abilities, and how do these proc off each other and other item effects and stuff, are all questions that need to be answered all the time, and they can lead to inconsistencies, right, as they've been like reworked and developed, and how philosophy's changed and stuff, and if things are just bugged or anything. You know, there's a million and one bugs I'm sure are still in the game that people don't run into that often, but or maybe do all the time but don't realize as well. League's had that forever as well. I think League is still an extremely buggy game. You just don't see it much because it affects such particular interactions that they're just not in your game very often, nor do you maybe notice them at times. But if you ever keep up with someone like Vandrel or something, or certain Reddit threads, there's constant bugs, all sorts of stuff, even game-breaking stuff at certain times, but yeah, most people don't encounter it. And I'm sure our game's perfectly the same, we just don't expose it as much because we don't have people looking for that kind of stuff. But when it does occur, yeah, I mean, there's channels to get to us with it, and it does hit us pretty quickly. We end up fixing a lot of those interactions pretty quickly. The common one is always Mutilator and how that interacts with things. It's always been problematic. We've never really quite had an item like this before in a MOBA in the way it works, and we currently don't have the technology to say this effect is going to occur on this ability, But when this ability does damage again in that same instance of that ability, don't do it again. We don't have that kind of like unique ability ID per instance of effect. Currently in the game, that's something I really, really want and have been asking for a very long time, but it's quite technical and difficult for us to put in. So you end up with these interactions with like Mutilator where we just have to kind of like make it not work on like howitzer ultimate at all, because otherwise it procs on every single missile. Because ideally I'd want it to just proc on the first missile, not again, never again. That would be something I'd rather do. There are other ways we can look to do it, which are super janky. We could do things like using our on-hit modifier to then make it do a % of the damage over a period of time, but that can also be weird with lots of small damage tick abilities where it's doing too much damage still because it's doing 1 damage per tick, and then that 1 damage times X amount of ticks is still more than the original damage would have been because that's to a minimum of 1. So there's all sorts of like design issues and problems that can occur from these things.
At some point, like we need also like to have like a description that is readable and understandable for someone that just read the description for the first time, because like sometimes when you go to this technical like workaround, then like you don't even understand what the item is doing anymore, which can be like a problem. But okay, so we can like basically we share like on the different like thing that is available, the feedback on the forum, the Reddit post. Ray like send a little kappa saying like we can DM him. People know in the chat.
Yeah.
But yeah. So last question about all of that is also like recommended build. Like how do you approach that? Like the game is changing quite a lot, so I would assume that's something that will be like very, very like look upon when we got close to free-to-play release. But right now, like it's still something that you like. How do you approach the recommended build overall?
Yeah, so this is something we currently manually maintain, which is a pain, I'll say that. It's not easy to maintain from every single patch, especially when item reworks happen. You got to think who has this item when they're recommended, do they still put it there, and all that stuff. And the balance changes on characters can change the items they build. We don't have like a sort of automatically updating recommended like League does, where it's all data driven and everything like that. That would be a goal one day for sure. Data driven recommended is super good. Obviously, the best player's going to build the best stuff, and then that's going to trickle down, and then the lower level players will eventually get that. So that's really good. Currently, when we come up with the design for a character, whether it's unique or a paragon one, I already have build ideas in mind. It's actually factored into the way the character's made. For example, TB, we just knew he'd be an on-hit carry pretty much from the start, and the way we wanted to construct him with his fast shooting and his double shot and everything, and we wanted his abilities to complement that too. So we knew that on-hit itemization was going to be the primary part of his recommended and easy thing to sort of like structure out initially. So we've already got an overall concept of what sort of items should this character build. There's obviously diverging build paths and alternatives that end up coming through testing, which maybe we catch early and then we can adjust recommended based off that. If not, it will go live and then maybe it could adjust off of that, because then live people can discover something, right? Obviously, Deathstalker TB popped up at a certain point, was really powerful. We knew Pen TB could exist. We were hoping that Pen TB could actually be an alternative to on-hit TB. It was just overly potent because Deathstalker was a very toxic item, which I knew would happen one day when it came to our corrode itemization. I was like, this assassin itemization, which is completely out of theme with assassin itemization because it's a ramping damage itemization of shred, doesn't really make sense to the assassin philosophy. I knew this would be a problem with an interaction one day. I just didn't know when that was going to pop up. And lo and behold, TB came along, and it was like, yes, that's the one, and this is why I wanted to rework it. So we eventually ended up getting to that. But yeah, it's mostly just assessing what was the initial idea behind the character, structure the recommended around that, tested a bunch, see if these work, see if any alternatives work, and slowly work through it. But it always needs updating and changing, and community might find something better. Sometimes they won't. Sometimes they'll be building the strangest things all the time, every single time, and it could be just completely suboptimal, even from just the statistical perspective. But yeah, community does what community wants.
Well, in the end, that's what is super complicated with recommended build, because like little deformation on my side because I used to take care of that in the previous work I was doing, and you have to find builds that works, that are easy to play in a sense, but at the same time they're not perfect, so like people can actually like improve on them and they feel like they're starting to control the thing. Because if you give them like the best build ever, they just build the same thing and they never really interact with the system, and they never feel smart in a sense. So like the balance is very intricate. It's not easy to find, and one item change, like you said, it's like a lot of work afterwards. But
yeah, and I think our system's more volatile for the reason that we've tried to create more flexibility within it. So there's less, perfect items to build every single time, and that means when something does change, it changes a lot. Just because if one item gets nerfed, that can open up two different options for a character, and one of those ends up becoming the best one. These sort of things can pop up very quickly. It's a very fine balance between those lines. Whereas like a Spellblade item on Aurelia is always going to be the best item. So if Sunder is the best item on her, you're always going to build Sunder on her, or whatever that is, just because of the interactions between the kits are so pinholed into these itemization options. Ours try to be a bit more open than that, and that can lead us into these more odd situations, especially as community discovers new options as well, and then that can become a new thing, which is a good thing. Like you said, if it's always the choice between this is the perfect item, but it's actually quite hard how to use this item. This has actually been a conversation I had recently about Basilisk on Grux, for example, right? I personally think Basilisk is a very strong item on Grux, first item for offlane, for example, right? And it can be really, really good. There are some matchups where you probably don't build it, but just the fact you could like basic attack someone, let the bleed tick on them, let the shred apply, you don't have to interact with them for this time, just keep hitting the wave or play passive for a moment. Now the shred's applied mostly, I can now engage on that person, I've got max shred instantly, and now I can just combo them and go all in on them, and I can kill them. That makes it very powerful, but as a player reading that interaction coming into the Grux matchup, you don't really know that until someone's either told you it, or you've played a lot of Grux, or you've experienced it a lot, which now makes Basilisk a worse kind to recommend first than maybe like Mutilator, because Mutilator it's just, I hit them, and I just fight them, and I just fight, and that's easy, that's Grux. That's like super simple. So that's like an easier approach to playing Grux, and maybe Mutilator should be his first recommended on offlane. So yeah, that was a recent conversation, and it's something we have to factor in when we build those recommended items.
Definitely, and that's something like I guess like also like here this type of little thing when like all the items are very like solidified and passive, like they're also like the readability of all those passive in game that can like maybe like not be always easy, and a lot of the thing like those players have to just like infer, because like you were talking about that, and that's a very nice interaction, but I never thought about it. But probably exactly. If I see like some like Basilisk stats on top of the guy and starting to build up with the bleed, like naturally I know I can interact with it, but that's more like for like beautifying the game once like everything is working perfectly. I think that's yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, no, yeah, I've health bars are a really important thing for conveying information, like you said. It's one thing that I really want to get into the game at some point, is just a revitalized health bar that shows much more information, right? Whether it's like states like invulnerability or anything like that, whether it's shred and how much of that is applied, whether it's unique character effects that are applied, like Sparrow stacks, Kira stacks, all these things. Health bars need to be pulling a lot more weight in that regard, so that's all like spec'd out, and hopefully that will be produced one day so that we can have lots more information and clarity, because like you said, it helps bring more quality of life to these items and how a player can perceive them, and arguably the descriptions can be better. At the end of the day, there's still always the issue that we need a wiki, and the people that want to be interested in that stuff will go to the wiki. If you ever read like League's in-game descriptions, you think like, that's cool, and then you go look at the wiki and you've got these paragraphs of text and you're like, wow, all this unique stuff, that's crazy, you can actually do so many different things with this. And it's just because you do have all these unique conditions that you have to set, and that's just to keep the game as sort of this competitive sanctuary in a sense, where you've got to make sure these interactions don't poorly interact with other things, or maybe create more diverse interactions for unique stuff. With character kits, there's all sorts of things you have to sort of put in that you try and make consistent, but will also be hard to understand and read at first glance.
Yeah. And so like here we are going like to move like to the second part of the interview, which is like mainly like how do you go about designing items. You already started to talk a little bit about it, about like the part that you were saying that you're trying to create like kind of like an open environment of item, and not really like tying item to specific heroes. So you can like, once again, like we have this mentality of being able to adapt your build and be able to itemize in a way that has to like change in every single game. And so like how do you like go for itemization? Like one example maybe we can use is like people that knew, like we have the whole rework of the carry item system that was like during like the early access. And so I guess like here there was like one like overarching goal that was like we want to offer different pathing, and then we try to build items that fulfill different role in those different pathing.
Yeah, so in general, classification of items, like building them for classes, is a good sort of general metric to go off of, and a good way to like sort of push people towards correct itemization, quote unquote. The way we help diversify it is mostly through effects that are slightly watered down maybe compared to something else. You know, if you had one really powerful effect in League, we'd try and take that and we'd make it a little bit weaker, and then we'd add some stuff to it that would make it like more generalized. So a really good example of this is actually Basilisk, again, where you've got this shred mechanic and stuff and characters that might utilize that, and then we've got this on-hit effect. So it's kind of an item that can be pretty good for like ability-based bruisers in certain cases, but characters like Kai and Greystone and all these basic type bruisers can also utilize it to a degree. Mutilate is another really good example of that. We give it the 2% on ability, we give it the 1% on basic attack in terms of max health damage. This is now an item that can be built on both those types of character, which helps keep the option open to more characters as well. So we try and do that with a lot of different items, and that's why we saw a lot of dual passives in previous iterations of items and stuff. We try and stay a little bit further away from 3 to 2 passives on items now where we can, mainly for complexity reasons and how much they can cover, but we still want them to be that sort of like open choice, where you pick this thing and you're still picking it for a particular reason, but your character interactions are not going to hone you into particular itemization too much, and you get a little bit more variety out of the items themselves, and you can think a bit more and have a bit more choice. Infernum's like a really good example of that as well. Just the way it's applied through basic attacks and abilities means you get good synergy for characters like Greystone, but you could still build on someone like Kai, but you could still build on someone like Crunch or something, right? Any of these characters that do lots of damage instances, that's more of the key thing for it, and this big consistent damage output, rather than someone that just applies it for abilities or just applies it for basic attacks and things like that. So it's just like, yeah, unifying these items across like multiple characters is like quite important, where we can at least.
And so like that kind of also like I think like answer like one of my following question in a sense, because like I was here like asking, are you thinking like it's fine that one item is a staple for a hero but not playable for any other hero? And like from that answer, like I understand it's no. And we can see that you're actually like trying to find like in the kits of some characters a way to not have like those like over bloated interaction. Like one thing that comes to mind is like the Chimera Unleash, like on its change. I think to allow that we don't have to change all item that is on it, because like just Chimera would just like be too strong with it and nobody else can actually like utilize this whole passing. So
yeah, in general, yes, I've tried to keep it open. There's going to be inevitable issues where certain characters are just like, this is my item, this works for me. Preferably we try not to keep that for a long period of time if that will occur, and we'll try and give them more options, particularly for them. I think in future this will be done for additional items. We've still got holes to fill, and we want to add more items to achieve that. At the same time, we can also do that for characters, you know. We can just think, like we were actually discussing again today, this is the thing we discussed today, is just Sephiroth, for example, right? What does this character build first item? And we're thinking a lot about jungle Sephiroth, right? And it's like, he doesn't really want to buy Fire Blossom, because that feels awkward, because now it's resting up my stacks, and it's really annoying, and it's getting in the way. But he also needs something that helps his jungle clear, and something that helps him clear a bit, and it's like, there's not really an item that Sev 100% wants early game, and that's not always a bad thing, but it can be in the sense that it's like, I don't have something that will just help me do what I want to do. It's almost like everything can help me do something, but I need this item that just helps me clear a bit and will allow me to like stay up in a fight a little bit longer or something, or help me achieve another goal that Sephiroth wants to achieve. We sort of did this with Kalari with Malady, for example, when that got changed. This is an item that can help her with her ganking, snowballing style, building up some damage and things like that with the sort of Parting Gifts passive, the Dark Harvest style passive, but she's also got jungle clear from it from the explosion, which can also be applicable in fights as well. But it's kind of unifying sort of two things for herself. It is a problematic item in a sense with characters like Fang, and there are issues with it, but it's also an item that helps Kalari achieve that goal. That's also maybe something we have to bring to characters like Sev, that there's these sort of things where it's advantageous to have an item that these characters want, because it's accomplishing all the goals they need to accomplish in the early game, which then allows them to diversify their build. So if we're ever going to have like, this character builds this item, it's usually that first item, maybe a little bit the second item, and there's some variation there, but from there it has to pretty much be variation. For me, I'd really dislike to see the same character building the same 5 items every single game, and that just always being optimal no matter what the enemy team composition and stuff is. Some people would do that anyway, but it's usually not optimal, which is a good thing. And yeah, I'd rather see more variation in that sort of 3, 4, 5 item slot where possible. 6 item slots helps achieve this further. You can actually build more tech items, and you can think a bit more about the curve of your build, which actually allows for more build variety, which is why I'm a big advocate advocate of trying to fit in another slot where we can, whether that's additional or whether that's how we do the crest in future. I'm not sure yet and how we rework that idea. But I definitely want to push towards that concept of a bit more slots for a bit more variation, because you just sometimes can't pick up your Spellbreak, your Spell Shield. You sometimes can't pick up your Golem's Gift. Sometimes you can't pick up your Salvation. Just something that's like, it really complements the rest of my build. It's also a really good item this game. It helps tech really well into it. But I just can't pick it up because I just need these other 5 items, and they're going to make me play the way I need to play to win this game. And now I feel like I'm missing an option. I feel like that one slot will do a hell of a lot for that issue.
Okay. So another question about it is like, here it's a little bit more open question, but like, how complex is too complex for an item in a MOBA, and how simple is too simple? Because overall, I feel like the whole like stat system is pretty simple when it comes to like what we have in Predecessor. We have like all the stat, but it's also like, I feel like in terms of passive, because we want those passive to be very open, there is like a lot of condition and thing that sometimes I feel like we're turning like into like the complex part of like reading the description once. Most of the time, like I need to read it twice to start like to understanding. And so like, where are the limit, and are you trying to stay like into a certain range? Once again, like we want to have complexity and openness, but at the same time we want onboarding and not losing players. So it's not an easy balance, I would assume.
Yeah, it can be tricky certain times. I think some of our items have fallen into this issue before. A lot of people still don't know how Wellspring works fully, but when you actually know how that item works and optimize the play pattern with it, it's extremely broken and probably one of the best items in the game, particularly for the characters that utilize it. We've had that issue with other items we've tried to make before, in terms of like support items. I'll give an example where you CC this guy, and when your allies basic attack him, they're going to heal themselves based off your max HP, and then it had like a second passive that interact with that. And all of that just becomes like a lot of depth and a lot to understand, and even more so that your allies have to understand. You need to know that this guy's applied this effect and I have to hit him and then I get health, and it's based off of what he's done, and you then have to interact with that system, so that can become really complex as well. So that's where it starts to toe the line of this is a bit too much. Especially when items start to define gameplay more so than the characters themselves, is where it becomes really problematic. This was actually quite a big thing in Paragon in the second card system, where, I'm not playing Kwong anymore, I'm playing Red Zone, and I'm running in the middle of the enemy team, and that's doing it for me. June Winds was another example, right? That was a really powerful, complex effect, where it's just like, now I'm playing Grim, but now I'm playing a turret that has 1 HP and one-shots people from across the map. And it's fun in a sense, but it really messes with the sort of like competitive idea of the game as well. And it can also be really hard for a new player to understand, right? If they're just getting one shot from this thing, that feels really unfun. So when items are like drastically altering the way the game works in such an extreme way, that's when they can be problematic, when they're providing effects that need multiple people to interact with them, and it's sort of like multiple layered as well. That's problematic. And then you start to get into depth issues. But you can be fairly in depth with items just as long as you contain them towards a purpose, and it's more about like, what am I trying to achieve with buying this item? And then people are going to think about the goal that it's trying to achieve, and therefore they don't need to think about what are other people going to do involving that and stuff, right? Am I just trying to do more damage to this guy? It doesn't really matter how you allow them to do that damage, as long as it's fitting into the natural way the character would want to play, because they're going to buy it on them, right? If Kalari's whole thing is she's going to dump her whole combo and have this death mark that pops, as long as this item's going to enhance that system, and the way she wants to play, then people who play Kalari will just buy it and they'll like it and it'll be cool and that'll be good for them, and you can provide advantages there. And it doesn't really matter if it's, going into a paragraph of text realistically that it's, doing X and Y. The only advantage to keeping it simpler is, as you said, onboarding, right? People understanding this is why you buy the item, and the player's understanding of it, rather than, it being an issue in terms of the effect itself. So yeah, there's advantages to keeping it brief, in a general sense, but if it provides a better gameplay loop, being complex is fine as long as it contributes towards the goal, essentially, and that's readable within the game space rather than the text.
That kind of remind me a little bit like what the way you are doing like the patch note. Like for instance, I remember like the 3 items that have been reworked for the assassins, and they kind of like have like a little tag associated with what is the goal of the item, and
Yes.
makes then like the passive is like helping that, but you don't really care, like that item is designed for that way. So yeah.
Yeah, realistically, when a new player looks at the recommended items, if they can see the icon, which will be a big contributing factor when we redo those, when we redo all of them, we want that to be a readable aspect to quality of life of the game. But when you see that, and you see the class it's built for, and you see that little bit of text that tells you what the item's for, like, anti-assassin or something or whatever, you should know, if I build that item for that purpose of stuff, I'm just going to get benefit, and you don't have to care about the effect as much. There's min-maxing, there's utilizing the effect in a better way. Like I said, with Wellspring, buffering. This is probably too much, where you need to basic attack to decrease the cooldown of the effect, and then you need to be shielding on this cooldown and stuff in order to achieve the better part of this effect. This starts going into a lot of loops that it's like, I can't just pick up this item and use it because it's going to be worse, and it has to be kind of balanced around that aspect then, whereas you actually want to balance it around the idea that people are going to be basic attacking, reducing the cooldown, and providing this big heal for their team, and if you can do that, then you can put it in a much healthier place where it isn't too like obnoxious at high level and bad at lower level, and it can equalize it a little bit. So yeah, it's that's the goal basically.
Nice. And so I think like here we are going to advance a little bit into the future of the item for Predecessor. And to be fair, there was like a few questions in the chat. You already answered quite a lot when it comes to like the vision slot, the pot slot, also like potential like even the flash in the future. So you kind of want to expand on those systems, especially like you were talking a lot about the vision, how you would like to make that like even more interactive, a little bit more war towards the words. Like the main question is like, of course, like more like normal item in the future, or even like more crests. Is it something that is like that you do want, or like a finite amount of item is something that you're happy with?
Yeah, so I thought a lot about items in terms of the amount you can have in the game. I think we can definitely fit in some more. That's not a problem, and I'm happy to introduce some more as time comes. We've had issues with that recently, which is why we'd rather... Not only do we need to fix old items anyway, so we might as well rework those into better spots, but then we want new effects as well, right, which we've come up with and think are good for the game, so we can do those at the same time, which is why these reworks happen. We're also in the beta period, so we're still trying to figure out what do we want this item system to look like before full release in like kind of its own state. So that's why a lot of reworks have been happening. I guarantee once we're actually out there, you know, on launch, we're not going to be reworking items every couple patches. We'll be waiting like for the full season kind of thing, or half season, before we do any like big reworks or anything. They'll have a lot more time and care put into them at that point. At the moment, it's really just figuring out what do we want this item system to be. So that's why there's been less additions for that reason. There's also some other technical reasons currently, but we'll get into that. But yeah, we'll have some more soon, hopefully, and have some additions to the system, which will be really nice, and some new items. Same idea of crests. I've got a couple... Not only just crest additions to the system, because we kind of want to keep 3 crests per thingy, but actual crest lines. You know, we introduced the occult crest at a certain point, and provided free options off of that for mages, for like less mana oriented mages, and maybe if we have non-mana mages in the future, if we ever have that concept pop in, that can now be a thing we can do. I'd love to provide more crest lines like that. We've got a couple of stats to cover in crest lines that we could, and stat lines in general for like bruises and stuff, and armor and things like this, that could be super fun, and cool tech options to build, and then we can do some cool actives off of that. So I'd love to have more crests in that regard. The other idea that I've been playing around with is whether do we cycle things out in certain cases. So is there a world where it's like we have this group of T3 items and we've had them for a season, and the game's cool, but we just need to switch up. So much like, I don't know, like Hearthstone, you swap a bunch of the T3s out, inject a bunch in that fulfill similar roles in different ways and cool stuff that changes up all the game, let them play with that for a season, and then the next season maybe introduce half of the old ones again and remove half of the new ones and try that, or introduce half another new set, like a third set, and then some old ones. You know, there's cool things you can do like that. Making items isn't the hardest thing in the world, so there is a world where that could be potentially a thing we do, but obviously there's competitive sort of, again, sanctuary of the game, and how do we keep that preserved. When people learn the game and play it a certain way, you don't want to like completely demolish that, which is a big issue when you rework items all the time, for example, is people learn these things and then you take it away and add a new thing, now they gotta learn that thing, and it can become quite sort of like overbearing on certain players, and we definitely want to avoid that, so we have to be careful of how much we'd swap out items, but it could be something we explore in future if people want more variation, more switch up, and that's more interesting to them, and we can see what item effects people like. Like, I think, for example, League doesn't experiment enough with preseason or other game modes to like what new items could be introduced to the game. You see things come in. They had one really big one. I can't remember what it was called. There's obviously Nexus splits, but then they had I don't know what it was called. It was like almost a parody themed one, and they introduced a ton of items. There was like this AP book that helped you destroy towers and stuff. There was an AP book that helped you, I think that was called like Rite of Ruin or something. There was one that gave you like move speed when you hit abilities like Wraith Leggings does. And they explored all these cool items. There's some really funny ones. There was like a Puppeteer one that like kept people close to you or something. There was like a blinking one. There was all sorts. So there was one that gave you one they turned into a keystone, Hail of Blades, of the really fast attacks really quick for the first 3 attacks. They did all these things, and it's like you can do that and add them into the game like properly, and introduce those effects, because they can be really cool, and you can use that to test effects. And I think you could experiment more in an area like League and provide more cool effects. I think there's a lot more they could do in that regard, and that's something I'd like to explore as well, as just more stuff that could be cool. And we can always test it, right? You test it in game mode, you test it in pre-seasons or whatever, and if it doesn't work, you don't add it. Simple as that. You can always stick with the old stuff. It's reliable at that point. But why not try new things, right? And constantly try and switch up the game a bit and keep it fresh rather than that it's kind of a bit stale.
Definitely. And so here, I think we can go into a few questions that the chat was having. I think a few things were already kind of answered. So there was a question about the thought on starting item. If I remember, you were telling that starting item are cool, but you don't like the aspect of you buy something to sell it later on. So I guess it's probably not something that is immediately in the package. Of course, if I'm saying something wrong, feel free to correct me here. There's also a question here, when mana and duo potion. I would assume that's when we're going to rework that slot. Probably this type of thing will arrive and bringing more diversity. But I think, of course, we don't have any win at that moment because there is a lot more in the package. There was a question about any plan for a rune system, to provide more personalization and thing. Is it something to explore, or could be more personalization maybe in other ways? Is something, or you're kind of happy with the overall structure and we just bring more personalization in that structure for now?
Yeah, on the first question quickly, I can go for each of them. For the first one, I'd love to have starter items again. So it's a thing I thought about a lot, right? Ever since we've done this current system, which is close to Smites, for example. Now, if I think that you just buy one in there and you'd levels up at final level or something, or you can upgrade it at final level. They did something similar to that at some point. To the idea of Crest, where it automatically acquires or acquires later on in the game, so you don't have to sell the item. I'm not against the idea of being able to sell the item if it means it can provide a powerful effect early. I think there's actually benefit to that. You can make laning phase more interesting with the choice that you provide there. I think Paragon almost did it quite well, right, with the easier farming or the font of experience and things like this. There's actually some cool options there. I did even scope some out at one point just to explore it and think what effects could go here, and there's some really cool ones you can do. There's some really unique stuff, and you can only do it within the scope of that, because it has to be an effect that's catered to early game. That means because it's only early game, you're going to get rid of it later anyway, so you don't have to worry about the late game ramifications of this effect and how it impacts there. And the gold cost of it can all be uniform, so you can keep all these effects equally powerful and stuff. There's lots of cool design things about it. So I do quite like it, and I actually don't mind the idea that you can sell it for the one fact that it's a really nice feeling when you're acquiring new items and it's I can't quite finish my T3, but now I can sell my starter item and that allows me to finish my T3, and that just feeling is just quite a nice one to invoke in players at certain periods of time within the game. Or you can, it's another good feeling when you get to 5 items and it's now I can sell my starter item, right, and build the next item, and the item served me well the entire game and done something quite powerful for me. So there is benefit to them. I'm not as against the concept as I was initially when I first came out with the system. I'm still happy it's not a total gold sink for the entire progress, but with it being a starting gold sink, I wouldn't be against it. So yeah, that's where I fall on that. What was the second question? Was potions, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, when we rework that slot, we'll explore the idea of mana potions, multi-potions. We want to be careful with the idea of it. In future, we're going to have, most likely, non-mana characters of some sort, and characters that use different resources, or no resource at all, or whatever it may be, probably different resources. And in that case, they'll be balanced around the concept that they can stay in lane through other conditions, and that's going to be relative to mana users. And when you start providing more options for mana sort of economy for mages and stuff, this can become really muddy. One thing that League ended up doing was basically keeping their mana to the tier item, and then your first mythic item in mid. So if you need lots of mana, you build tier. If you don't need lots of mana, you just build the mythic, and that's kind of it. And now you can balance around the idea that mages have this mana plus the 600 from the item, and that's it. That's their mana pool for the game. And now you can balance all their kits around that and how their economy works in lane, and you can balance that versus all the non-mana characters that exist. And that keeps, again, a good competitive structure for the idea of how these characters work, function against each other, and the readability of the game. Whereas if you have mana pots now, which were very OP towards the end of League before they got removed, was that you could just acquire these things, and it disrupts that entire idea that when this person gets ahead, they can all stick in lane for a very extended period of time, using more spells than intended. We already have river buffs, which contribute towards that, which can be problematic. But yeah, so it can cause issues. It could also be something we cater towards, and it could be a strength of economy putting into those. Maybe it's just the amount of gold they should be worth and what you're going to lose out on for these effects. Maybe we need item effects that are going to do a similar thing, right? Like they have Lost Chapter in League, which allows your laning phase to stay mana sustained. Maybe we just need items like that instead of pots. It's a really big design question. It's actually way bigger than people think. It's not just as simple as add pots and it's all good. That's a really important difficult distinction as it is. Especially when we're considering like Occult Crest and Magician Crest, you've already got that trade-off for health and mana. When you throw in health pot and mana pot there, what happens when you're double dipping into the mana economy? What happens when you're double dipping into health economy relative to that? And how much mana do you lose out on that? And is that fun to engage with? There's so much around it. It's actually
that's super
really
interesting because like for me, I was like a little bit like the guy in the question, like it's just like it's normal, like just like we have the health pot, you can bring the mana pot, the dual pot, like no big deal. But actually, like there is like so much going on and like a very long lasting decision actually coming to that. So yeah, well, thank you for clarifying this aspect because that's definitely something I didn't like see, and so that's why it's so great to have like the developers coming to talk. And so like there was the last part about like the rune potential, like rune system potential.
Yeah, tertiary systems have definitely something we've explored a lot. And we're thinking which one's the most optimal for our game, pretty much. I'm pretty sure everyone on the team's happy to have one. In some form, it's just when we make it and how we make it and what does it look like. For me, I want things more hero-facing personally. When it comes to the tertiary systems, the leagues is very sort of external to the character and complements the character through other means. Whereas, for example, Dota's is much more hero-facing, where it's direct interactions with the character. It's like, my stun lasts a longer amount of time or something like this, or my abilities are longer range or a bigger AoE. I think these are way more interesting in a general sense. I think you can almost do a mix of the two. But I think it's really fun to have like hero-specific augments and kit changes. Dota does that really well, not just through that system, but the Aghanim system they have with the Aghanim Scepter and the Aghanim's Crystal that then give you a new ability or change one of your abilities and enhance it, which can like differentiate the playstyle and transform the character partway through the game. The talent system can also do that. It's why the characters are versatile. Do I play like a support Monkey King? Do I play a carry Monkey King? And the talent system can help me decide that and pushes really far into different areas. I think these are really interesting concepts to explore. I think they're a lot more exciting and fun than something like runes when it comes to sort of like the casual aspect on it. I think it's just how do you make that readable is the biggest question to answer with that, mainly for the casual player, and how do you know which variant you're playing against and stuff, how extreme do you make it? These are all things to consider, but it's one angle I personally love to explore and see what we could do with. In a general sense, Paragon heroes are a bit more blank slate than a lot of MOBA characters. I think we've already tried to enhance them a bunch by either adding an ability or increasing and improving upon abilities where we can, because they were fairly simple in their initial conception, which is fine. And I think talents can help do that even further. For example, right, a system akin to that where you can make a character feel even more in-depth or potent through this other system. That could be an exploration for it. So yeah, we're exploring it. It's definitely something we want to have at some point. We'll be prototyping stuff in due time, and we'll see what we land on. But it's something that's definitely gonna help improve the longevity of the game through player customization of their playstyle and character, which is a thing I'm a huge advocate for. As you see with quests and everything, it's just I want people to be able to pick this character and be able to play it the way they want to play it, or have it play exactly the way they want to play the game, essentially. And I think that's the fun thing. You find the perfect character, and then you can play it the perfect way you want to play it, and index on the way you want to play Predecessor, other than how the game tells you to play it or how these characters tell you to play it.
Yeah, it's always like a dream, but in a sense also like super complicated, because like if you leave too much player agency, then in the competitive side there will be like stuff that will be like completely broken. Kind of remember like one time like Smite explored like letting player buy stats, every stat that they were willing, and that broke completely the game. So they couldn't keep that into the game because too many player agency at some point. Like you still need to feel your role as a character in a sense, and you can expand, but I guess you still have to circle that around something, otherwise the competitive aspect can crumble very fast. So it's like, once again, game design, a lot of balance to find, and finding the right middle ground that is very, very hard.
Yeah, so every single question is pretty much how do we pick the lesser of two evils, because there's always downsides to literally every decision you will pick, and players will point out that decision and call you an idiot for picking that decision because of those downsides, when in reality all the other things had probably greater downsides or equally bad downsides, and we just tried to choose the best one for them that they'd enjoy the most. And this system can be very much a symptom of that as well, and it can be the same idea. Like I said, like do you act like League and stay very contained within a box where you can control a character and its fantasy very, very well so that it becomes a perfect competitive game? Or do you go like Dota and go a bit more wacky and allow people to play the character in multiple different roles in completely different ways to the point where it's very unreadable more than anything? If anything, it can harm the casual aspect of the game more than the competitive, because it becomes really hard to understand what does this character do, because it just does so many different things now. Whereas in competitive, at least the versatility can then end up being contained with some craft from the developers, and therefore you can make it so that flexibility is an aspect of the game and a core part of competitive, and then you build that into the systems, right? And Dota's actually quite successful in that regard in terms of its competitive scene and how well it does, and how the players enjoy it and all the aspects they can approach the game is very in depth, and that's one of the appeals of it, right? It's a very different audience from League in that regard because of that. So you sort of got the two like extremes, and it's like, do we find a halfway point? Do we push more towards one side? Not sure. This is why the exploration needs to be done, and why we have to be very careful with how we implement the system.
And that brings me to one of the notes that I forget to talk about when I was talking about the current design of Predecessor items. And that's the thing that in Predecessor we don't have any boots. Like you can consider Galaxy Greaves and the Dreads, but that's actually like a big decision because a lot of MOBA were revolving around this idea that you do your laning phase and you buy your first boots item and not suddenly the map's open. And why is the reason of like no boots? And is that like changing drastically how you play the early game in Predecessor compared to others MOBA?
Yeah, so boots do a couple things really well. One, they delay the first item spike in a nice way usually, or make it so that first item spike is more defined relative to people that will pick up boots before you, and that can become a tactical choice if I need boots in the matchup or not. I can also lend into other systems like tertiary, of like magical footwear in League, and when do I pick up this so that I automatically get my boot, but I can't build it early game, which means I can't pick it into a matchup where I gotta dodge stuff like Jhin or Vel'Koz or something. So there's like loads of interesting thought that can come behind it when it comes to sort of more competitive side. There's also the advantage that it helps contain that laning phase a bit more. Roaming can't happen till boots are acquired. Maybe that character that does want to roam can't acquire boots first because they need an item for their matchup, or they're just going to lose and die anyway, so then they can't roam. So it helps contain those kind of matchups. So there's actually lots of good advantages to boots, and there can be really good reasons to have them. It's also how your game was initially constructed, and how your map was constructed. You know, if we had boots and Predecessor, we'd have to slow everyone down quite a lot at the initial stages of the game. This is going to make it very sort of like one way or the other when you don't have boots and do have boots getting hit by abilities, because boots are usually like for them to be meaningful, they have to be a percent of the movement speed. And when we're working with movement speeds that instead of being like 300, like League to 400, we're working with like 700, 800 plus. These kind of move speeds, it has to be more extreme for boots. So if we were to start more towards like 600 was like a ratio, or 550, you're going to feel very, very, very slow at the start of the game, and then you acquire boots, then you're going to feel very, very quick relative, but you'd be the normal speed we are now, because that's how a map would be constructed. Even if we made the map bigger, it would be problematic, and I think in our game even more so, because you can dodge basic attacks and do all these other things of movement. Move speed's even more important to that point, where when it's a consistent factor, with our game it's only going to allow us to basically have that sort of onboarding aspect where it's understandable how to dodge this thing, how to play around this thing, kind of like Overwatch, right? Hopping on a character, someone uses this ability towards me, I know how fast I can move and how to move away from it, just instinctually from the way my character moves. Whereas when you've got boots and not got boots, you've got a polarizing sort of aspect there from when you acquire it and when you don't acquire it, and that can cause problematic sort of areas there. So we opted into no boots for sort of mainly that reason more than anything, and the way we constructed the map around that as well. Map could still be bigger because we've actually ended up speeding up since then, because we wanted, again, gameplay a little faster pace. We wanted the ability to dodge skill shots more, because skill shots were too confirmed in Pred, arguably still can be. We'd like to have more skill expression in the game, and movement comes into that as a big thing. Maybe one day, you need a dodge roll or something in order to accommodate for the fact that there's going to be instant hit scan abilities and stuff in the game, which you don't really get in games like League. So yeah, that's the main reason why we don't have them. It's mostly just like, how do we contain? And in a sense, they're kind of an archaic system where containing the laning phase is done in so many different ways now when it comes to item spikes and the way towers function and kill gold relative to farm gold and all these things. Everything's changed since then. And arguably you don't need boots for that reason, so it more just comes down to that first item spike benefit, and arguably with crests we shift that up even more and it's different there. And we also just don't want them taking up a slot. We've already got crests taking up one, we wouldn't want boots to take another one. Even if we were to go to 6 items, then you just had boots, it's not as exciting. They're not the most fun thing to build or impactful thing in a lot of cases. They don't feel that great to build. So there's lots of like little downsides as well, which is why we don't necessarily need them.
Yeah. well, personally, I like to not have boots because I always like felt constrained and having to buy that every single time I play the game to start playing the game and lose my first 5-6 minutes in like being like in the slow and in the
Yeah.
mud. I never liked that, but I was like just willing to see a little bit like all the reasoning behind it. Um, so yeah, that was probably like all the thing I had to ask. I think I cover also like the question like from the chat. Of course, like we're reaching like the end of the interview, so like you're not forced to have anything, but we know that season 3 is coming like soon. And do you have any leaks regarding that part, or do we just have to enjoy some competitive gameplay with the PCC 5 until we actually like get new stuff to be able to enjoy?
There's a roadmap coming soon, so that'll be helpful. There'll be a lot of stuff portrayed on there that people can see what's up and coming. I'm sure there can be lots of speculation based off of that, which will be super cool.
Yes.
But otherwise, I don't have too much to share, unfortunately, for season 3. But there's some really exciting stuff in it that we're prepping for and been working super hard for. Things have been obviously a bit slower. That's partially because of the UI stuff, but there's also other aspects of the game we've been working on. And those things should start to come to fruition in season 3, which should be super exciting. So hope to see that pop up. It's going to be a good one. It's got a cool name. Alex did a good job with it. I like that. Just like I did the last one with the Ascension stuff. Really cool. Ties quite heavily into, again, our unique character. I'm having a ton of fun working on that character. It's something that's like quite a familiar concept in MOBAs, but we're doing it in a, I'd say, pretty interesting way within our environment. And I think it's pretty cool. So it's a fun one to work on. I'm excited for that.
I'm definitely excited to discover all the things that will be on the roadmap. Especially since like you said, like season 2 has been like kind of slowed down quite a bit from the UI part, and so I can't wait to like we get back into like more exciting stuff as we had like in the season 1. So like as usual, Blood, thank you for coming. Thank you for answering all the questions very openly. It has been a blast. I learned a lot about like how the items work in Predecessor and how like we can expect for the future. Once again, like here we're discussing of like also like some wish list and the thing that people are looking for at Omeda, but we still like need to first like have a very good basis for like the free-to-play release. So probably like not everything we discuss here is going to appear next week or in season 3, of course not. People bear that in mind. We were just like focused on the topic of items and also like giving us a whole idea of like how the thought process are and why like certain things are the way they are. It was very, very interesting, very enlightening. Thank you everyone for coming. Also thank you for Soul Reaper for the raid that allowed like a lot of people to be able to assist to that talk. And thank you for the little follow and sub. And as usual, like Blood, it has been a pleasure. It's always a pleasure to have someone from Omeda. And thank you everyone for the chat for coming. And I hope you enjoyed the interview. And I can't wait to catch you all like for another time. Thank you everyone. Have a wonderful night or wonderful afternoon, depending on where you are in the world.
Thank you.